Why modesty brings respect and confidence. What if I told you that the loudest person in the room is really the most respected? What if true confidence doesn't roar but whispers? Strange, isn't it? We live in a world where everyone is shouting, posting, proving. Yet the people who stand tallest in our memory are often the quietest in the moment. Think about it. The colleague who brags about every little win, how much respect do they truly earn? Now think of the person who doesn't have to announce their greatness because their actions already speak. That's the secret of modesty. It doesn't shrink you, it magnifies you. The loudest person in the room is rarely the most respected. Modesty magnifies your influence because actions speak louder than self-promotion. True leaders often impress with presence, not noise. Modesty is like a hidden diamond. It shines naturally without forcing attention. Confidence grows when you stop chasing validation and start living authentically. Respect built on modesty is lasting, while arrogance fades quickly. The loudest person in the room is rarely the most respected, and yet it's so easy to fall into the trap of thinking volume equals value. Picture a meeting room where one voice keeps cutting across others, insisting, repeating, pushing louder as if sheer noise will translate into importance. Everyone notices, yes, but notice is not the same as respect. Notice fades as soon as the voice quiets. Respect, on the other hand, lingers long after words are spoken. Think back to times when you've been in a group, maybe at work, maybe with friends, and someone dominates the conversation with endless stories about their achievements, their struggles, their brilliance. At first you might listen, maybe even be entertained, but as the minutes pass, something inside begins to shift. Instead of admiration, you start to feel fatigue. Instead of being impressed, you feel the urge to escape. And silently, you begin to lose respect. Because respect is never demanded, it's earned in silence, in substance, in how someone makes you feel, rather than how loudly they speak. Now contrast that with another kind of presence. Someone who doesn't jump into every pause, who listens more than they speak. When they finally do contribute, the room leans in, not because they demanded attention, but because they quietly earned it. Their words carry weight because they are rare, deliberate, and necessary. People remember not just what was said, but how it was said. There's a quiet strength in restraint, and that strength plants respect in the minds of others. I once heard a leader say, "The most powerful person in the room is not the one speaking the most, but the one others wait to hear." That struck me deeply because it flips the script we're conditioned to believe. We're taught to sell ourselves, to make noise, to get noticed. But being noticed is not the same as being respected. Think of figures in history. Mahatma Gandhi, for example, was not a booming, thunderous speaker. His voice was soft, his presence humble, yet entire nations leaned in to hear him. Why? Because he didn't fight for volume, he stood for truth. The quiet confidence of his modesty commanded more respect than the loudest voices of opposition ever could. Respect is magnetic that way. It doesn't chase, it attracts. Even in our everyday lives, we can see the difference. Imagine you're at a dinner table with friends. One person is bragging about their new car, their expensive vacation, their promotion. The table nods politely, smiles, maybe even claps. But then another friend, who has been silent most of the night, shares a story about helping a neighbor through a tough time or quietly mentions how grateful they are for small victories in life. Suddenly the room softens. People feel something real. And long after the dinner ends, it's not the flashy brag they remember, it's the quiet sincerity. Respect doesn't live in the spotlight. It lives in the shadows of humility. There's also a psychological truth here. When someone talks too much about themselves, it signals insecurity more than confidence. Noise becomes a mask, a cover for doubt. But modesty signals the opposite. It says, I don't need to prove anything because I already know my worth. And that kind of inner security radiates outward. People respect what feels grounded, what feels authentic. Loudness without substance feels hollow, but modesty with substance feels unshakable. I remember once sitting with a mentor who hardly spoke during our first conversation. I kept wondering if I was saying too much, filling the silence, trying to impress. But then, after listening intently, he said just one sentence that shifted my entire perspective. One sentence, quietly delivered, hit harder than paragraphs of advice from anyone else. I left not remembering most of what I had said, but remembering everything about how he spoke. That's when I realized respect isn't built on the number of words spoken, but on their depth. And sometimes depth comes only when silence has been allowed to stretch. So the loudest person in the room may get attention for a moment, but attention is not respect. Respect is deeper, slower, and infinitely more powerful. It is born in modesty, in the ability to let your presence, your actions, and your rare words hold the kind of weight that noise never can. ChatGPT said, modesty magnifies your influence because actions always speak louder than self-promotion. And the truth is, people are far more impressed by what you do than by what you say you've done. Imagine someone walking into a room and announcing all their successes, listing achievements one after another as if stacking trophies in front of your face. At first, you might nod. You might even feel a flicker of admiration. But slowly, that admiration turns into resistance. Because when someone is busy telling the world how great they are, they leave no room for the world to decide it for themselves. Respect, after all, isn't something you can shout into existence. It's something others choose to give you when your actions speak so loudly that words become unnecessary. I once heard a phrase that stuck with me. Don't tell people your plans, show them your results. There is something magnetic about a person who doesn't feel the need to advertise their greatness, but instead lets their work, their character, and their impact do the talking. It's like the difference between a billboard and a sunrise. A billboard is loud, bright, and demanding attention, but people often tune it out because it feels forced. A sunrise doesn't need to shout. It simply rises, and everyone stops to watch in awe. Modesty is that sunrise. It magnifies your influence by allowing your actions to illuminate what words never could. Think about the workplace. You've seen it, the colleague who emails the whole team just to highlight their role in every small project. They demand recognition. They attach their name to everything. And yes, people notice them, but not in the way they hope. Over time, their reputation becomes one of neediness, of craving validation. Then there's the other colleague, the one who works quietly, delivers results, and doesn't feel the need to broadcast every contribution. When credit is given, they accept it humbly, often redirecting praise to others. And here's the twist: while the loud self-promoter fades into irritation, the modest one slowly builds a reputation of reliability, strength, and trust. They don't have to claim influence. Their influence is felt. There's an old saying, empty vessels make the most noise. And it's true. The people who truly have depth don't need to rattle. They know that silence mixed with substance speaks volumes. I remember meeting a well-known athlete who had just broken records in his field. I expected him to be larger than life, full of stories about himself, but instead, he asked questions. He listened. He turned the spotlight outward. And because he didn't make the moment about himself, everyone left the room respecting him more. He didn't announce his greatness. He allowed his greatness to be discovered. That's the essence of modesty. It doesn't diminish you. It magnifies the way others see you. Even in friendships and relationships, this truth holds. Imagine a friend who constantly reminds you of how generous they are, how much they've sacrificed, how much they've done for you. At some point, you start doubting the sincerity of their giving because every act comes with a receipt attached. Now imagine another friend who does things quietly, checking in on you when you're low, showing up when it matters, never expecting applause. Their actions etch deeper into your heart than any declaration ever could. And long after the moment has passed, you remember not their words, but their deeds, influence born from modesty creates loyalty, trust, and deep respect because it feels real. There's also a hidden strength in this way of living. When you let actions speak, you free yourself from the exhausting cycle of trying to prove, persuade, or perform for approval. You no longer waste energy telling people who you are. You simply live it, and people believe what they see far more than what they hear. A modest person doesn't have to defend their worth because their worth has already been proven by the quiet evidence of their life. One of my mentors once told me, if you are truly good at what you do, you won't need to say it. Others will. That stuck with me because it's not about being invisible. It's about being undeniable. Modesty gives people the space to come to their own conclusion about your value, and when they do, their respect is genuine, not forced. And here's the beautiful irony: the person who spends less time talking about their greatness ends up being talked about the most. Their influence multiplies precisely because they didn't chase it. So modesty magnifies your influence not by shrinking you, but by amplifying what actually matters. Your actions, your character, your quiet strength. Words may impress for a moment, but actions linger in memory, echoing long after the noise has faded, leaving behind not just recognition, but respect. True leaders often impress with presence, not noise, and this is something we've all felt even if we didn't have the words for it. Think of the moments when someone walked into a room and without saying much, everyone turned their head. It wasn't because they were loud, it wasn't because they demanded attention, but because something about them radiated calm, confidence, and steadiness. That's presence. It's a quiet gravity that pulls others in without effort. Presence is never about volume, it's about energy. And when it's real, it lingers even after the person has left. I once attended a leadership conference where several high-level executives were on stage. Most of them did what you would expect. They spoke fast, they used flashy slides, they cracked rehearsed jokes, they tried to project authority through enthusiasm. But one man stood out. He walked to the stage without rushing, without even adjusting the microphone. He stood in silence for just a few seconds, scanning the crowd, letting the room settle. And then he spoke in a soft, steady voice, almost conversational. No theatrics, no fireworks. Yet the entire audience leaned forward, straining to catch every word. Later, people didn't talk about the slides or the jokes from the other speakers. They talked about him, the one who hardly raised his voice but left the deepest impression. That's the paradox of presence. The less you try to be impressive, the more impressive you become. Presence is about how you make people feel in your company. Think about leaders you've respected. Were they the ones who dominated every conversation, or the ones who made you feel seen when you spoke? A true leader listens more than they talk. They don't just fill the air with their voice, they create space for others to breathe, to contribute, to feel important. That's why people follow them, not because they're the loudest, but because they're the ones who make others feel valued. There's a story I once heard about Nelson Mandela. When he had meetings, he would often speak last. He would listen to every voice in the room, paying attention, giving space, and only when everyone else had spoken would he share his thoughts. This wasn't because he didn't have ideas or confidence, but because he knew leadership wasn't about showing how smart you are. It's about drawing wisdom from the group and guiding it. His presence wasn't in the dominance of his words, but in the weight of his listening. People respected him not just for what he said, but for the dignity he gave to others through silence. You can see the same dynamic in everyday life. Think about two managers. One barges into meetings, raises their voice, insists they have all the answers. The team nods, but deep down, they feel dismissed and disconnected. The other manager sits down, asks questions, listens with genuine curiosity, and speaks only when it adds clarity. That second manager might use fewer words, but the respect they gain is tenfold. The difference isn't in knowledge, it's in presence. There's also something magnetic about people who don't rush to fill silence. Silence makes most of us uncomfortable, so we try to cover it up with chatter. But a leader who can sit calmly in that quiet, who isn't afraid of stillness, shows a kind of strength that words can't touch. It signals they aren't desperate for approval or attention. They are grounded. And grounded people draw others in, because in a noisy, restless world, groundedness feels like a rare treasure. I remember once being in a room with a mentor who said almost nothing for the first half hour of a group discussion. We all kept glancing at him, wondering what he was thinking. And when he finally spoke, his words landed like stones in water, rippling outward in a way none of ours had. It wasn't that he was more intelligent, but that his restraint gave his words a kind of sacred weight. His presence turned simple sentences into lessons we remembered for years. Presence is not about trying to be memorable, it's about being real in such a way that people can't help but remember you. Noise fades quickly, but presence stays. Leaders who understand this don't compete for volume, they cultivate stillness, focus, and intention. They know that sometimes the most powerful thing you can bring into a room is not more words, but more awareness, more listening, more calm energy. And in the end, that's what people respect. The leader whose presence makes them feel steadier, stronger, and more seen. Imagine a diamond hidden deep in the earth. It doesn't scream, it doesn't advertise itself. It simply exists, untouched, unbothered, waiting for the right moment when light will strike it and reveal its brilliance. That's the essence of modesty. It doesn't clamor for attention, yet when people finally notice, they cannot look away. The irony is that the more a person tries to prove their worth, the less convincing they seem, while the one who remains quietly authentic often shines brighter than anyone else in the room. I remember meeting a young woman at a community event who was working behind the scenes, arranging chairs, setting up the stage, handing out programs. She wasn't in the spotlight, she wasn't introducing speakers, she wasn't dressed to impress, but I noticed how people naturally gravitated toward her. When someone dropped a stack of papers, she was the first to kneel down and help. When an elderly guest looked lost, she gently guided them to their seat. She never once announced her efforts, but by the end of the evening, everyone knew her name. Not because she told them, but because others whispered it with admiration. She was like that hidden diamond, unassuming yet impossible to ignore once the light touched her actions. Contrast that with someone who flashes constantly, who tries to shine by force. You've seen them too, the person who insists on telling you how important they are, how many titles they hold, how many successes they've racked up. Their light feels artificial, like neon signs in the night, loud, bright, but exhausting. People glance, yes, but they don't stay. True brilliance doesn't need neon. It just needs authenticity. There's a quiet magic in people who let their excellence be discovered rather than announced. They're like books with plain covers. You don't expect much, but when you open them, the depth inside leaves you speechless. That's modesty. It's not about hiding your value. It's about trusting that your value will reveal itself at the right time. And when it does, it carries far more weight than anything you could have shouted. I think of a story about a violinist who played in the subway, disguised in ordinary clothes. Most people walked past, never realizing they were brushing by one of the world's greatest musicians. A handful of strangers stopped, drawn in by the purity of the music, unaware of the fame behind the face. That's what modesty is. It's the ability to play your music without needing applause, knowing that those who recognize it will truly appreciate it. When you're modest, your worth isn't measured by noise, but by the quiet impact you leave on the few who really notice. Even in personal relationships, modesty creates a kind of beauty that arrogance never can. Imagine someone who constantly reminds their partner of all they've done. Look how much I sacrifice for you. Look how lucky you are to have me. Over time, those words feel heavy, even suffocating. But think of the partner who simply shows love through small, consistent gestures. The one who brings you tea when you're tired, who listens without judgment, who supports without conditions. Their actions are quiet, almost invisible, but they form a bond of respect so much stronger than words ever could. That's the hidden diamond, shining quietly yet treasured beyond measure. Modesty also has a way of building anticipation. When someone doesn't reveal everything, doesn't rush to claim credit, it makes people curious. They lean in, wanting to know more. It's the same reason why the most powerful stories often leave space between the lines. The unspoken becomes more powerful than the spoken. Modesty works like that. It leaves room for discovery, and in discovery lies the deepest respect. One of my mentors once told me, the moment you stop trying to prove your worth is the moment people start to see it. That struck me because it means modesty isn't passive. It's a choice, a discipline, a confidence that says, I know who I am and I don't need to announce it. Just like the diamond doesn't scream for recognition, modesty doesn't beg for validation. It simply shines when the right light finds it. And when that happens, people don't just notice, they remember. So modesty is not weakness, it's power disguised in humility. It's the diamond buried in silence, waiting for the right moment to glimmer. And when it finally shines, it does so with a brilliance that noise can never imitate. Respect built on modesty is lasting, while arrogance fades quickly. And the proof of that truth is all around us if we stop and pay attention. Think about the people you admired when you were younger, the ones who seemed larger than life because they were bold, loud, and unapologetic. Maybe it was a celebrity, an athlete, a boss, or even someone in your own circle who seemed to command the room with bravado. At the time, it felt impressive, almost intoxicating, to watch them take up so much space. But years later, where are they? How much of that admiration lasted? More often than not, arrogance burns bright for a moment, but fizzles out just as fast, leaving behind not respect, but exhaustion and even bitterness in the people who once cheered them on. Now contrast that with the quiet figures in your life, the teacher who never raised their voice but guided you with patience, the relative who gave generously without reminding you of their generosity, the friend who stood by you during difficult times without needing credit. Those are the people whose names you still speak with reverence, long after they're gone from your daily life. Their modesty didn't make them invisible, it made their respect eternal. It's the difference between a sparkler that shines bright for a second and disappears, and a candle that burns steadily, lighting the room long after the noise of celebration has ended. I once worked with a manager who loved recognition. He would take every opportunity to remind the team of his position, to take credit for successes, to make sure everyone knew he was in charge. People tolerated him, but no one truly respected him. Meetings became performances, and his loudness drowned out collaboration. When he eventually left, nobody missed him. His name wasn't carried with respect, only relief. On the other hand, there was another manager who never needed to raise his voice or put his name on every project. He gave credit away, he lifted others, and he led with modesty. Years after leaving that workplace, people still tell stories about him, still call him a mentor, still speak his name with warmth. His respect lasted because it was built not on noise, but on character. Arrogance fades because it is shallow, built on the fragile foundation of ego. It requires constant feeding, applause, validation, recognition. The moment those things are gone, the arrogance crumbles, and so does the image it tried so hard to create. Modesty, though, builds on something deeper. It doesn't rely on external validation. It grows roots in authenticity, humility, and consistency. And what grows from deep roots doesn't fall when the wind changes. Think of great athletes. Some win championships and celebrate with arrogance, shouting about their greatness. Their highlight reels make headlines for a season, but as years pass, their names fade. Others, though, win quietly, celebrate with grace, thank their teams, and move on with dignity. Those are the athletes whose legacies are carved into history. People don't just remember what they achieved, they remember how they carried themselves. Arrogance may make you memorable in the moment, but modesty makes you unforgettable forever. Even in personal relationships, the same truth holds. Picture two friends, one who constantly reminds you of the favors they've done, the sacrifices they've made, the reasons you should be grateful. At first, you may feel indebted, but slowly resentment grows. Their arrogance in giving turns every act into a transaction. Now think of the friend who gives without asking for recognition, who supports you without ever keeping score. Years later, when you think of loyalty and kindness, it's their face that comes to mind. The respect you feel for them is deep, unshakable, and lasting. There's a quote I once heard that says, "Arrogance is loud, modesty is quiet, but it's the quiet that echoes longest." That's the essence of it. Arrogance is like shouting into the wind. It may carry for a while, but soon it's gone forgotten. Modesty is like carving words into stone. It takes time, but once carved, it remains. I remember sitting in a lecture hall where a speaker asked, "When you leave this world, what will people say about you?" The room fell silent. And then he added, "They won't remember the titles you held or the things you boasted about. They'll remember how you treated them, how you made them feel." That struck me deeply, because respect is not something you can demand. It's a gift people give you based on how your life touched theirs. And the people who live with modesty, who don't need to demand, are the ones who receive that gift most freely. So yes, arrogance might dazzle for a moment, but it never lasts. Modesty, though, plants seeds of respect in people's hearts, and those seeds grow into trees that stand long after you are gone. And isn't that the kind of respect we all truly want? The kind that outlives us, the kind that whispers our name with admiration long after our voice has gone silent. So here we are, standing at the edge of a choice between noise or presence, between arrogance that fades or modesty that lasts, between chasing attention or commanding respect. The truth is simple, but it's not easy. Modesty takes courage. Courage to stay quiet when the world demands that you shout. Courage to let your actions speak when others are selling empty words. Courage to trust that the respect you earn slowly will last longer than the applause you can steal quickly. So I ask you tonight, what do you want to be remembered for? The noise that fades by morning, or the presence that echoes for years? Respect is not given to the loudest. It is given to the truest. Confidence is not built in boasting. It is built in humility. And greatness is not found in arrogance. It is found in modesty. Choose modesty. Choose respect. Choose the kind of confidence that no one can take away from you. Because in the end, the world will not remember how loud you were. It will remember how deeply you touched it. And that is your power. That is your legacy. That is why modesty brings respect and confidence. So when you walk out of this room, don't just shine quietly. Shine so deeply, so authentically, that the world has no choice but to remember. Because real power doesn't scream, it lasts. And lasting power is yours.